Order, order. And can I welcome our two witnesses to this first evidence session about exiting the EU and devolution. And could I ask each of our witnesses to identify themselves for the record?
Good morning. I'm Alan Page. I'm the Professor of Public Law at the University of Dundee.
I'm Richard Rawlings, Professor of Public Law at UCL.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. The purpose of our committee is to scrutinise government and public services and to make reports and recommendations in order that the public should be able to have confidence in our system of government and public services. And the purpose of this inquiry is to explore how we are going to adapt our arrangements in the United Kingdom between the four parliaments and the four governments in order that there should be a smooth transition and a harmonious transition as we leave the European Union. I would invite you to give short and crisp answers. I may pull you up if you go on too long, and the same goes for the questions. And may I first call on Paul Flynn.
The First Minister for Wales and First Minister for Scotland described this bill as a naked power grab. Is it a fair description?
Well, that was some time ago, and I think there have been suggestions since then that we've moved on from the language of power grab, which is not to say that we shouldn't say something about the background to that language, but...
We're dealing with... I mean, there's nothing in the explanatory notes that's changed the bill in the form it was. I know discussions are going on the whole time, but the bill is as it was originally framed, and there's been no retreat from that position that powers would be taken away from Scotland and Wales, powers they have now, and there's nothing in the bill to indicate that they will be returned at any specific time. Isn't that a fair description of a power grab?
Professor Page. Sorry.
Yes, I can see the background to... I understand the background to that claim. I hesitate slightly over the language because there is a difference of view between what is and what is not devolved. I happen to actually take the view that things like agriculture are devolved to the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, and that therefore in those terms you could talk about a power grab, but I don't find it particularly helpful language in understanding what are the key or the most important points about this legislation and the process of leaving the European Union or the implications of that for the devolved institutions.
I think Mr. Flynn's question actually goes to the heart of the controversy over the bill from a devolution point of view, because I think it's possible to give two answers. The UK ministers would say we are not grabbing because things are coming back from the EU that the devolves in practice because of the restriction to abide by EU law. They didn't have those powers in the first place, and there's a very careful insistence in the bill on not rolling back devolution in that sense. If, however, you look at it from the devolved perspective, they would look at powers coming back from the EU, and they would say, well, who's grabbing the powers coming back from the EU? Answer from their perspective, central government. So you can actually answer that, and I think the very fact, Mr. Flynn, that you can give two answers to that, I think tells you a lot about the controversy surrounding this bill, because it shows that it's possible here to have different constitutional perspectives.
I'm having only two answers. Is it a pleasant relief?
Well, I stopped at two.
Yes. You will be... and the pleasure of hearing you at the Welsh Select Committee. Are you appearing at the Irish committees and the Scottish bodies as well? And isn't this an example of the House of Commons' duplication of effort in the fact that this matter is being considered, I believe, by 4 select committees simultaneously?
the answer to that is, the first answer is yes. I'm in the Scottish Parliament in a couple of weeks' time, and then I'll be in the National Assembly. But that, I mean, you would expect, wouldn't you, that we're now operating a system with several legislatures and assemblies in the United Kingdom, and it seems to me only natural that the several legislatures and assemblies, all of them, and of course we hope that the Northern Ireland Assembly soon starts working again, all of them will want to mount their own inquiries. The second question about the House of Commons, yes, I mean, obviously from an evidence giver's point of view, it is quite energy sapping to be asked by different committees. But again, I mean, you can see it in the sense that this particular committee has a sort of a general overview function, whereas specialist committees such as, environment or home affairs, etc., will want to be looking at the implications for Brexit in their particular areas. So, you can see inevitably there will be a plurality of committee inquiries.
On the 12th of September, the Scottish and Welsh governments simultaneously published legislative consent memoranda. The memoranda stated that neither government would present legislative consent motion for the bill in its current form. Aren't they inevitably on a collision course on this? And wouldn't it be a constitutional outrage for this bill to go through without the consent of the devolved legislature?
Well, what they said was that they would not bring forward a motion in respect of the bill in its present form, but I think they left open the possibility that were the bill to be amended in certain respects, then they would bring forward such a motion. And that is really where we are at the moment. You rightly emphasise that the bill is as it is at the moment. The question is, can it be changed in such a way as to secure the consent of the devolved legislatures? In other words, can this be done by agreement rather than pushing it through in the face of opposition from the devolved legislatures?
I mean, the Sewell Convention states that the UK Parliament would not normally legislate with regard to devolved matters except with the agreement of the devolved legislature. Correct. I mean, what force does the Sewell Convention have? Well,
we know following the Miller case in the Supreme Court that it doesn't have the force of law, confirming what is already written into the devolution legislation, that this Parliament retains the power to legislate in respect of devolved matters. It's not justiciable, it's not legally enforceable. The Convention, the courts will not discuss its meaning, scope of application and so on, which leaves the consequences or the implications to the political process. And were this Parliament to legislate, notwithstanding the opposition of all legislatures, the argument would undoubtedly be made that was constitutional outrage, it was unconstitutional. How exactly that would play in the court of public opinion?
I mean, the Supreme Court established the supremacy of Parliament, but don't you think that the Sewell Convention is politically binding, even if it's not legally binding?
I would certainly take the view that it is, yes.
Okay.
Mr. Jones, and then Mr. Cowan, supplementaries on this matter.
Yeah, just briefly on the issue of the Sewell Convention, which was purported to be incorporated into statute by both the Scotland and Wales Acts, but which the Supreme Court subsequently ruled, as you rightly said, did not have any binding effect. There's also a declaration, I think, in both pieces of legislation that the relevant bodies are permanent parts of the Constitution. There's this fad for declaratory legislation. Would you like to comment as to what you feel is the purpose of Parliament passing law, which is quite clearly on the face of it not binding and frankly will not be held up in court at a later stage?
I think it represents a solemn and binding commitment. It's the most solemn expression of intention that you can provide under our Constitution.
Even though it's not binding?
Even though it's not binding, but the difference is that it's not me as a minister saying it, it's not me as a Prime Minister saying it, it's not me as a member of the House of Lords saying it, it's this Parliament saying that the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government are a permanent part of the UK's constitutional arrangements, and I think worth pointing out as well that they won't cease to be so without the vote of the people of Scotland voting in the referendum, and I assume the Welsh legislation is to the same effect. So I don't think it's pointless.
You've got the wriggle room in both pieces of legislation, the use of the word normally. I've no doubt we'll be discussing that at great length during this session, but again, doesn't that sound rather Weasley, coming in a piece of legislation?
Well, it doesn't sound Weasley in a convention, and what the legislation faithfully did was implement the agreement of the Smith Commission that the convention be put on a statutory footing, and that is precisely what it did, word for word, including the Weasley word normal.
Could I add to that, because I'd like to draw an answer to the two questions together, if I may, Chair. I mean, I have published a report on this whole set of issues, which was published about 10 days ago, and I believe it's been made available to the committee. I mean, what I think I would want to make 2 points. I mean, first is, I hope we don't get to the issue of whether the UK Parliament decides that it has to override a refusal of legislative consent. I mean, I would sincerely hope that we don't get there. And my own view is that it would be unwise and unnecessary to get there. I mean, we may have to at the end of the day, but I very much hope that we don't. And then secondly, and it comes back to, I think, the question posed by Mr. Flynn, I think what will happen is that what is happening is that the Scots and the Welsh governments have both tabled legislative consent memorandums, as they are required to do by standing orders in the devolved assemblies. And at the same time, as Professor Page said, they have made it clear that on the bill as currently drafted, they would not recommend legislative consent. And I think our working assumption has to be that the bill as currently drafted simply will not get legislative consent in the Scottish Parliament and the National Assembly for Wales. Now, of course, that leaves open the possibility of amendments to the bill and also the work on common frameworks that I'm sure we'll come on to talk about. And clearly the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government are leaving open the possibility that if there are amendments and if the work on common frameworks go well, they may well be minded later on in the process to recommend legislative consent. But following, for example, the illustration of the Wales Act 2007, and Mr. Jones will be obviously very aware of this, we got legislative consent from the National Assembly for Wales very late on in the process, after, in fact, I believe, there was the financial settlement with the Treasury. And again, I mean, that's what, I mean, I'm sure colleagues around the table, in a sense, would expect and anticipate colleagues in the devolved Assembly and Parliament to do. You would wait, wouldn't you, until you actually see what as much as you can see of the final deal before you decide whether you would recommend legislative consent to your Assembly or Parliament. I mean, that just seems to be natural political behaviour.
Mr. Cowan.
Yeah. Professor Ronnie, in your paper, BrExit and the Territorial Constitution, you say the prospect of essentially English departments taking on UK-wide responsibilities by dint of the repatriation of EU competencies naturally raises concern elsewhere in the Union about conflicts of interest. You also go on to say, attention is drawn to the double-hatted character of Whitehall, the large-scale function fusion of the UK government with the government of England in a classically non-federal system. So is this a time now to create a federal system?
Well, if elsewhere in the report, Mr. Cowan, you will see that I say that I just don't think that this is a federal moment, right? And it seems to me that the conditions are just not right, if indeed they're ever going to be. Yes. And it seems to me that the Scottish Government would have no interest in going down the federal route, because clearly the Scottish Government's agenda is ultimately an independence agenda for Scotland. So why would you get involved in a formally written federal project? Likewise, if you believe in a united Ireland, in Northern Ireland, I think you're going to be very suspicious, very hesitant about the idea of moving towards a federal United Kingdom. And then, of course, there are the broader, the ones that colleagues will no doubt be familiar with from the old Kilbrandon report about how do you fit England into a federal structure. In terms of the sheer size of England and what would be the relationship between an English Parliament and a UK Parliament. So I think there have always been significant issues around the construction of a federal system for the UK, and I think at this particular moment, especially where we are in Scotland and Northern Ireland, the prospect of a federal solution just sort of isn't on the table. And in a way, my report is about how do you navigate that, right? How do you, what should the approach be, right? What approach, in particular, should the UK government be taking in the context where we don't have a federal system and where, frankly, we're not going to have a federal system overnight to deal with the kind of issues that are being raised by BrExit?
Right, we've had some quite long questions and some quite long answers, so we need to move ahead rather more quickly now. Sandy Martin.
Yeah. Could you outline the operation of clauses 10 and 11? What are the strengths and weaknesses of the clauses? Do you think that they are ultimately going to enhance or decrease the powers of the devolved governments?
Well, let's deal with that, shall we?
Okay.
Yes, shall I begin? Yeah. Okay. Clause 10. This is the corresponding powers for the devolved institutions corresponding to clauses 7 to 9. Strengths, clause 10 acknowledges that the devolved institutions have a role to play in getting the statute book into shape, ensuring continued compliance with the UK's international obligations, the implementation of any withdrawal agreement. It acknowledges that there is a role for them in all of this. Weaknesses, if you compare the powers that the devolved institutions will have compared with the powers which UK ministers will have, the powers that the Scottish ministers, for example, will have are hedged about by a whole series of restrictions which don't apply to their UK counterparts. And the devolved institutions understandably take objection to some of these restrictions and have sought their removal. At the same time, UK ministers have a virtually unfettered power to legislate in pursuit of these objectives across the whole of the United Kingdom, including in those areas which are devolved to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. That's clause 10. Clause 11. This takes us back to where we began. And the strength of clause 11 is that it secures legal continuity. The argument is that the devolved institutions were bound beforehand and that therefore that they should continue to be bound after exit day. In my view, that's a justification that doesn't actually stand up to or doesn't withstand serious scrutiny, because the obligation on the devolved institutions to comply with EU law is rooted in EU membership. It's about ensuring that the UK as a member state can comply with its obligations as a member of the European Union. It's not caught short because Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland is doing something contrary to EU law. Take EU membership away, and that ceases to have any justification. Why would you expect Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland to be bound after the UK has left? Surely you would expect the exact opposite, and I think that was the starting point for the devolved institutions' response to the bill. And that in turn then gives rise to the suspicion, which takes us back to the point at which we started, that the real purpose of clause 11 is not to secure legal continuity, but to, if you like, strip the devolved institutions of any bargaining power that they might have when it comes to the discussion of common frameworks and all the rest. And so its weakness, or the weakness of clause 11, I would have said, is that it contributes to a climate of suspicion in which the devolved administration suspect that this is about removing powers from them, and that as Professor Rawlings explains in his paper, the Whitehall departments will find it convenient to hang on to these powers rather than to pass them on. And the other thing that I would add is, and we could perhaps come on to this, is beyond that, I don't see a justification for Clause 11, and I can see ways in which we could proceed, I think, perfectly well without it. But perhaps
on that specific point, Professor Page, I mean, it is going to be extremely difficult to carry through BrExit at all. Do you believe that the devolved administrations should have any role in the bargaining process?
The bargaining process over what the domestic implications are? Absolutely, yes.
I'm sorry,
are we talking about the
that was an
negotiations?
ambiguous question my colleague asked. Are you suggesting that the devolved assemblies and government should be involved in the negotiations between the UK government and the EU? Is that what you were asking?
I mean, I got it. I may have misunderstood, but I was sort of taking it that Professor Page was saying that he saw the basic intention of Clause 11 as to inoculate against any involvement of the devolved.
Not so much to inoculate against any involvement, but as to prevent them or to weaken them when it comes to the discussion of issues which will have to be discussed about common frameworks, etc., in the wake of EU withdrawal. Exit.
But it is about what happens in the wake of EU withdrawal, not about
during
the
the process.
Not the negotiation.
I would really like to emphasise this, Chair. Right, the debate over Clause 11 is not a debate about should Brexit happen or shouldn't Brexit happen. It is about if powers are coming back from the EU to the UK as a result of Brexit, how are we going to appropriately allocate those powers around the UK constitution? What is going to be the appropriate balance between the centre and the devolved administrations? Right? And what the concern from the devolveds is that Clause 11, when it comes to that negotiation, when it comes to that set of discussions, are essentially stacking the cards in favour of the centre. Right? And there is a particular concern, just to pick up Mr. Cowan's point, because I don't think we did pick it up otherwise, there is a particular concern, and you know, we can't get away from this, that the UK government does have two hats. It's central government, but we're not in a federal constitution, so it's also the government of England. And it's not simply a question of conflict of interest. I mean, all colleagues will know, whatever institutions we come from, institutions have their subcultures, their networks, their assumptions. And the big departments in Whitehall, I mean, a department like DEFRA is essentially an English department. I mean, that's what it does, right? It regulates and it subsidises, you know, in relation to farming, etc., in England. And there is inevitably a concern in the other parts of the country that, you know, that their interests will tend to get lost because of that. Not necessarily because of some sort of conspiracy theory. It's just sort of, you know, subconsciously about how institutions operate in practice.
And would you say, I mean, that I know there's a lot of concern about Clause 11 actually creating a conferred powers model for the powers of development administrations rather than the reserved powers model. Would you say that was one of the dangers of Clause 11?
As Clause 11 is envisaged as working in the bill, yes, that is undoubtedly a danger because, as you know, both the Welsh and Scottish settlements, the Scottish settlement from day one, has been a reserved powers model whereby the Scottish Parliament has the power to legislate in all areas, save for those reserved to this Parliament, to the UK Parliament. What we're now talking about is the Scottish Parliament, the National Assembly of Wales, continuing to be bound by retained EU law as opposed to EU law, save where it is decided that they should not be bound, which from the point of view of someone trying to work out what the Scottish Parliament can and cannot do is going to make it an extraordinarily difficult task because you're going to, you know, work through the things that, well, we can't do, and then we've got this retained EU law restriction, but has it been lifted, and if so, in what way? And it will just make legislating
Professor Rawlings, do you need to add anything to that?
No, I mean, I think that in a sense is a very important point from end users' perspective. I mean, I think there's a danger in this that we can just tend to focus in terms of negotiations between governments, right? But we've also got a responsibility, haven't we, to produce a product at the end of the day which business can work with,
but
consumer groups can work with, etc. It's got to be clear.
But this question about reserved and devolved models, reserved and conferred models, I mean, how do you persuade somebody that this isn't just some kind of theological debate or one about political perception? How does it actually affect the lives of ordinary voters in Scotland, England or Wales or wherever?
Because it will hamstring, it will have the effect of hamstringing the devolved legislatures so that they will not be able to do that which is sensible, because instead of having discrete policy areas which belong to them...
But that's because certain powers have been reserved, not because it's a conferred model or a reserved powers model.
Well, right. The advantage of the reserved powers model is that it allowed the devolution of discrete, meaningful, sensible policy areas. For example, agriculture, education, health, so that one can naturally look to the Scottish Parliament to legislate in those areas. When you move into a conferred powers model, and Wales has a much longer experience of this, then you're not, you don't have that same relatively straightforward confidence.
That the reserved powers models were, within the EU, very tidy and quite binary, and they didn't create the challenges that will exist for example, having the equivalent of shared competencies between the UK Parliament and government and the devolved governments and parliaments. So it is necessarily going to be much messier than it was and much less tidy than it was. What does it matter whether we call it a conferral model or a reserved powers model? What does that matter?
Okay, let's drop the language of reserved and conferred and just talk about how messy it's going to be. And our common objective, I think, has... But
that's the substance of the change that's got to be dealt with.
Well, not necessarily. I would argue you don't need Clause 11 at all. But what you do need are common frameworks.
Right, we'll come to that in a minute. Anything to add, Professor?
Well, I would simply say, and I think Mr. Jones will in particular will understand where I'm coming from. One of my concerns is that we may be producing uncertainty and a lack of clarity, which in turn will lead to litigation. And Mr. Jones in particular will be very well aware of all the Supreme Court litigation that we've had around a conferred powers model.
And Mrs. Gillan too.
And I'm sorry, yes, absolutely. Of course, Mrs. Gillan in particular, because you would have been their, responsible minister at the time. I apologise for that. So I think we've got to remember, Chair, that this goes to an issue of competence for the devolved administrations. In a way, all the discussions about meanings in the bill become very sharp when we get to the devolved administrations, because it's a question for them as to whether or not they actually have powers. And the government lawyers have to be able to advise the presiding officers of the National Assembly and the Scottish Parliament will have to make rulings as to whether something is within competence. And again, they will be open to challenge in areas where, frankly, challenge is very likely, because, of course, we're talking about market regulation. And where there is market regulation, there is money involved. And where there is money involved, there are lawyers involved. And we have to, I think, to be very aware of that. And just very quickly to finish, it seems to me that where we want to get to at the end of the day, however we get there, is reserved powers models, and in the reservations covering common frameworks. So, for example, a reservation could read the subject matter of such and such, the subject matter being the relevant common framework that you are keeping on a pan-UK basis.
Thank you. Anybody else on this point? Can I, David Jones,
Yeah,
briefly.
Briefly, if I may. You touched on it in the last part of your answer then, and you said a few moments ago too that the debate is essentially about where the balance lies between the United Kingdom government on the one hand and the devolved administrations on the other, by which I infer that you mean that there should be such a balance struck, that some powers should be held at a Westminster level and others passed down to...
Very much so.
Yeah. Well, isn't that the position of the government? The government itself has said that essentially what we're engaging in through Clause 11 is establishing a holding pattern, and that in due course there will be powers passing further down to the Welsh Assembly, the Scottish Parliament, and so on. So really, I'm just wondering, is it just a question of how this is to be achieved, and are you saying that Clause 11 is not the way of achieving it?
I think that's right. I mean, first of all, can I say, absolutely. It seems to me that, we will need some common frameworks. And if one thinks about, a clear example like animal diseases, right, it would be ridiculous if we didn't have an agreed common framework across the United Kingdom on something like animal diseases. And I'm sure that...
Policies in Wales and England.
Yeah, sure. And, then
Wales doesn't kill badgers and we reduce the level of disease. England kills badgers
absolutely.
and increase the level of disease.
But then it goes to the specificity of the common framework, right? How far is the common framework going to be taken, right? And clearly, that's a whole further set of questions. So yes, there are going to be common frameworks. There must be common frameworks in certain situations, and that is open for discussion and negotiation.
Right.
Now, what I would say, sorry, just to finish the answer to Mr. Jones, because I think he asked two questions, is that I think it should be done the other way around. Right? I know this committee is very concerned about the lack of trust that has developed between the central government and the devolved administrations, and to think about ways in which, in a realistic way, we can generate that trust. Well, what I would suggest to the committee is that if you go along to the devolved administrations and wave what I would call legislative blunderbuss in their faces, which is Clause 11, that is not a good way of building trust with the devolved administrations. And I know what I know what you're saying, Mr. Jones, about the intention of the government. That is not clear on the face of the bill, right? The bill itself, right, is not written in terms of a transitional arrangement when it comes to Clause 11. Right? I mean,
although you know from pronouncements that the government said...
Yes, but I mean, having been formally a legal advisor to House of Lords Constitution Committee, one of the things that the wise old owls on the Constitution Committee told me first up was governments come and go, ministers come and go. What matters is on the face of the statute book.
Mr. Cowan, briefly, and then we must move on.
As an alternative to Mr. Jones' proposals, we don't know better if we give all the powers which are due to Scotland up to Scotland immediately, then over the course of time we can negotiate which ones we'd like to give back.
I think it's perfectly possible to do that.
It is?
Yeah.
Fabulous.
I can explain how.
We'll do that sometime down the road at some point.
But Mr. Professor Page, you only described these powers originally as notionally devolved.
Not nominally devolved.
Nominally devolved.
Yes, that's right. And I did, in fact, I think, anticipate that we would find ourselves going down this particular route whereby the UK government would be able to argue that, well, actually, you will end up with more real powers afterwards than you had before, because these powers were exercised at the EU level and you had little real say in what was actually decided. But if we step back from a moment and think about what are the implications of withdrawal for the devolution settlements, I did this piece of work for the Scottish Parliament way back at the beginning, and I went through all the EU competences, and what I was struck by was how few would actually come to the devolved legislatures. Most of them will come to this Parliament, and of course I sought around for what is the explanation for this, and the conclusion I came to was that the reservations, the reserve matters, which dictate that these powers will fall to this Parliament, are all about, essentially, or for the most part, about, and I coined the phrase, a UK single market. Yeah. And so what we're forgetting in all of this, and we were discussing this before we came in, as to whether or not the parliamentary drafter had thought about it, is what we're forgetting is the work that is done already in the devolution settlements in terms of preserving the UK single market. A vast amount of work is done. And so the problem is not one of just Clause 11, and if we don't have Clause 11, we'll not be able to do anything about this. And so my solution, quite simply, would be this. One, to recognise the work that is done by the existing devolution settlements, and, following up Mr. Cowan's suggestion, is to simply have a standstill agreement whereby we all agree that we're not going to do anything that will imperil common frameworks until we work this question out. It's a perfectly logical way of doing it. And the other factor in this, and the third element, is mutual self-interest. Where is it in the interest of Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, or indeed England, to take action which would imperil the UK single market? It's in all our interest to keep it going. So, unlike the EU, which is still trying to create a single market, we already have one. And all that we're trying to do is prevent damage to that market. That's what the Lancaster House Declaration is about.
Okay, just to challenge you on a bit of detail.
Right.
If we were, for example, to do a free trade agreement with the EU concerning agricultural products, they would expect us to have UK regulation on fertiliser regulations, GMO marketing and cultivation, for example. Mm-hmm. Those matters will be devolved unless we reserve these powers.
But what is there to prevent us agreeing on GMO regulations?
That I perfectly understand, yes. Yeah. Anything else?
Yeah, Chair, that's a very
Mr. Rawlings, Professor Rawlings, and then...
Can I just add one thing to that, because I think it's very important. Can I draw the attention of the committee to existing powers in the devolved legislation, intervention powers from the Secretary of State, where the Secretary of State has powers to require action by the devolved administrations and legislatures, or to prohibit it if those actions are either required for the purposes of international obligations, or if the devolves are threatening to do something which would offend international obligations. And those powers are already there. And of course they've not tended to come to the fore because we've been inside the European Union, right, with all of that. But if we would have a withdrawal agreement, a treaty with the European Union, then those intervention powers are already there on the face of the devolution statutes.
David? That's answered my question. Okay. Moving on. Kelvin Hopkins. Sorry, did you want to say?
Well, following on from that debate, I think my question has perhaps had a little more complication. Can you say or explain whether converting EU law into a new body of UK law as retained EU law will affect all the nations of the UK in the same way? If not, why would this not be the case, and what will be the consequences?
I'll have a go at that, I think. The position that I would want to emphasise, again, it comes back to Mr. Cowan's original question, is that we do have a different situation with England. That we have to remember that the UK government is the central government, but it's also the government for England. Now, when we have BrExit, looking on that basis, we will then have parliamentary sovereignty in this place, in the sense that we can say we've always had parliamentary sovereignty, but we all know that as long as we've been within the European Union, acts of Parliament have had to navigate the requirements of the European Union in practice. That will go, right, and clearly we don't know to what extent there'll be a withdrawal agreement and etc. But just in general terms, that will go, which means that Westminster will be able to pass new acts of Parliament, changing things as Westminster thinks appropriate. That, of course, we tend to think of on a pan-UK basis. But Westminster is also the legislature for England. so that if Westminster wanted to change retained EU law for England, clearly it could do so. Parliamentary sovereignty. Now if we jump over to Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland, they are devolved administrations and devolved legislatures. Now, however we define common frameworks, right, we can have that argument, but in terms of the bill, they will be constrained because they won't be able to change retained EU law to a very considerable extent. I mean, we talk about that. So that immediately there's a different situation. And it comes about because of the nature of our constitution, that we don't have a federal constitution. We have this double-hatted nature of UK government. And I think that's why it's so important to keep that double-hatted character in mind. Because it does, Brexit does produce the situation that you have a shift in if you like, the constitutional positions of England over there and the three Celtic countries over there. As long as we're within the EU law applies across. Once we're with Brexit, England and the United Kingdom will be having parliamentary sovereignty. The devolveds, well, they are devolved, so they have devolved powers, but there are also, of course, reserved powers.
I have to say, I won't pursue it now, but I can see complications arising in certain areas. My next question, what problems could arise if powers were repatriated directly to devolved institutions? How would these problems be best dealt with?
Sorry, I missed the first part of it.
What problems could arise if powers were repatriated directly to devolved institutions?
Well, I think in my earlier answer I indicated I thought that was a very good question. I'm not sure that problems would arise if you adopt my preferred course of recognising the limitations that are already there in the devolution legislation, and you would need some form of standstill agreement whereby we all agree that we're not going to do anything that harms the UK single market until we've worked out this business of common frameworks, which we will need to do and can only be done, I think, by sitting down and actually going through these 111, 64 and 149 other EU competences that intersect with devolved powers.
But your approach, would it not require a degree of consensus and agreement and friendship between the devolved governments?
That would be my ultimate goal. Yes.
Well, you see, but Ms. Hopkins, I mean, this is why I think we're both very pleased with the fact that the Joint Ministerial Committee, European negotiations, met for the first time for 7 or 8 months, about 8 days ago, and set out a set of principles. And all of the administrations at the Joint Ministerial Committee committed themselves, one, to the proposition that yes, there will be a need for some common frameworks, and two, it is our aim, our collective aim, to work together to create those common frameworks. Now, of course, that's just the beginning, right? And of course we're going to have a big debate about what those common frameworks, where we need them and what they should be. But that seems to me to be entirely the right way of proceeding, right? And can I draw colleagues' attention to some very interesting and important evidence, I think, from the Secretary of State for Scotland, David Mundell, before the Scottish Affairs Committee last week, where he made clear that work is now going on rapidly in the light of that JNC committee, and two particular things are happening. He talked about a, quote, dive down, unquote, which involves officials actually taking the lists and really working down in their specialist areas as to where they think common frameworks might be required, right, and what those common frameworks might look like. And in my report, I've actually tried to give them some design questions that they might be interested to look at for doing that. And that's exactly, to me, what should be happening. And at the same time, he talked about a body called an amendments forum, where apparently the lawyers and officials from UK government and the devolved administrations are going to be meeting in the next couple of weeks, actually to talk through possible amendments to the EU withdrawal bill dealing with this whole issue of devolved competence. And that seems to me to be exactly what should be happening. And then, if at the end of the day there are sticking points, if at the end of the day we really cannot come to agreements on particular things, it's at that point that UK ministers should be thinking parliamentary sovereignty, and that yes, we may have to come back to Parliament and say in a particular area we really must have a pan-UK framework. We haven't been able to agree one, we will have to establish one. But it's I suppose what we're both saying is that Clause 11 has it the wrong way round, right? That essentially you go through negotiation, discussion, you explore the potential for agreement, and frankly, you will get agreement on a large number of these items for the reasons that Alan has explained, mutual interest. And then if you get a sticking point, then you can think about parliamentary sovereignty. But don't do it first up through Clause 11, because what is bound to happen, they will simply refuse legislative consent for understandable reasons. There will be a lack of cooperation, a lack of trust, and that is to nobody's advantage.
Thank you. Okay. Mr. Jones?
Well, just pursuing the last point, I take it from what you've just said that you don't entirely rule out overriding the Seal Convention if there should be sticking points that cannot be overcome by negotiation.
Yeah, I've said that I mean, personally, I think it's the absurd example, the hypothetical example, but if at the end of the day, right, we got a situation, I mean, it's that an agreement could not be come to, right, then clearly it would be, as Alan said, it would be open for UK ministers to come to Westminster and say it is vital from the perspective of the United Kingdom that we have a common framework in this situation. We've done our best. Agreement has proved impossible. This is, in the terms of the Sewell Convention, I think you pointed this out, Mr. Jones, this would be the abnormal situation in which you would come along. And that seems to me that then what you're saying is that parliamentary sovereignty in this circumstance is a reserve power rather than a first up power, yes, as it's being used in Clause 11. And then, of course, it would be a matter of public debate, and the minister would come to Westminster and explain why this was necessary and important, and that seems to me to be the appropriate way forward.
Yes, so I take it from your answer that in both constitutional and legal terms it would be entirely proper for that to happen. However, would there not be political consequences of that? Well,
in legal terms, I think Professor Page has answered that in terms of Miller, that yes, the UK ministers could do that. This would be open and transparent. It would have to be justified in Westminster as to why this would happen, right? And in the Scottish Parliament, or the National Assembly for Wales, or wherever it was, the First Ministers would have to be explaining why they were objecting to having a common framework in this particular situation. And at that point it becomes a political debate. But what you are doing there is, as I say, I think that you will actually, I don't think we'll get to that situation, but clearly it's a correct answer to a question to answer it. But at that point, it's very transparent. It's very open. And if UK ministers have a good case for a common framework, well, that's the situation.
And you made a very important point a while ago about the issue of end users, because ultimately we're not discussing this in a vacuum. These are issues that have a practical effect upon practical people. Most conspicuously, I think, really, in terms of agriculture, which I think is the area that's most affected. Both NFU Cymru and the Farmers Union of Wales have acknowledged the need for overarching UK-wide frameworks. So should not both the Welsh administration and the United Kingdom government be consulting far more closely with these end users when they determine policy and the issue of where, as you put it, the balance of competences should lie?
Yeah, shall I answer that one and then I'll let okay. Yeah, I mean, this is one of my criticisms, Mr. Jones, about the process so far, because I think we should be much further on in this process than we are, and this just isn't an intergovernmental thing. I would have liked to have seen, first, clearly we had to have the list of intersections. Then secondly, we had to have an idea, and this is what Mr. Mundell is now working on, is where do we think we need common frameworks? Where is it clear we don't need common frameworks? And what are the areas where there is a genuine discussion to be had? So that's where we are now. I think we should have been there 6 months ago. And then third, we begin to sketch out what those common frameworks might look like. And it's at that point, right, and I think we should already been here, it's exactly there where you should have caught, yes, you should be talking, if you're in agriculture, you should be talking to the farming associations, because this isn't just, I mean, this common framework isn't just an agreement between, this isn't signed off between the governments. Yes, I mean, the commercial interests in themselves have got to be, directly consulted with what these common frameworks look like and how they are crafted. And I just think we're behind the curve here, and that we should have been out to consultation already, frankly.
Well, if there's any comfort to you, I can tell you that those discussions have been taken.
Yes, I know consultations, but if I may say so, not in a sort of those consultations have been happening, but not in a sort of an open public way, because of course there are lots of stakeholders involved, and it does seem to me that we really should have had more transparency around that.
Cheryl Gillan.
I think we all agree that JMCEN should have met. I mean, it met 4 times, I think, and then there was this huge hiatus before it met. And I just can't understand what went wrong with the machinery of government would have allowed that gap. This is a question you may not be able to answer. I just wondered whether you had done a deep dive into the lists of intersecting areas, and you've done a risk analysis as to which areas would be more at risk for agreement, non-agreement than agreement. I presume agriculture is obviously right at the top of the list.
I haven't done a deep dive, but I think I did identify the prime candidates in the work that I did before.
Uh-huh.
So
Would you like to share those with us? Because I'm not.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's reasonably straightforward, and we've already mentioned some of them at least. So we're talking about, these are devolved powers at the moment, powers to control the movement of food, animals, animal products, plants, plant products, animal feeding stuffs, fertilizers, pesticides. We're talking about product standards, animal health and welfare, food safety, food labelling, food composition. And then in a slightly different set of areas, financial assistance to industry, including the agricultural industry, public procurement, and fishing. And I'm not saying that's comprehensive, but these are the ones that came out from the work that I did. And I think the lists that have been circulated as a result, I think it was the Secretary of State talked about a deep dive. Yes, it includes absolutely everything, but realistically, I think we're talking about a relatively limited number of areas, which is why I think this, clause 11 businesses is in danger of getting out of all proportion and obscuring the real need, which is to work out what these common frameworks are.
Yeah.
Could I put on the record just first a comment about the lists, because I know the committee will be visiting Cardiff and Edinburgh, that's my understanding. But two items which struck me when I looked at the lists. The first, and I think, Mrs. Gillan, that you will immediately see the significance of both of these items because they have a particular Welsh dimension. The first one that struck me is that on the list, there's no reference to regional economic development and structural funds. That doesn't appear on the list. Now, of course, one explanation for that would be what appears in the Conservative Party manifesto about a UK enterprise, a UK prosperity fund. But as a witness, I have to kind of put it on the record that I did find it remarkable that a list of intersections, which is what it claims to be, does not include structural funding. Because, of course, when one has one's Welsh hat on, what are we talking about? £370 million annually to Wales. So that list, should we say it's an interesting mapping exercise. Mapping, you used to kind of capture in bits of the world that you didn't know about. This one seems to be a reverse. Something has gone missing from this map. Which I think is quite interesting to think about. The second one that struck me.
Sorry, can I just challenge you on that? I mean, in the government's defence, that EU's regional and structural funds, they just disappear. They cease to exist as EU regional and structural funds. The question is, what does the government replace it with?
But
it's an exclusive competence.
But it's not
a shared competence.
Oh, but structural funding, no. I mean, structural funding involves the devolved administrations in a lot of implementation, a lot of financial management.
But in terms of legislative competence, the EU regional structural funds are an exclusive competence, not a shared competence. Not something like agriculture, for example.
Well, one would have to look then more closely at quite how that map is described, because the way in which I read that map was the intersections of EU competence with devolution. Right, and if one looks at it in that perspective, one of the biggest areas of intersection would be structural funding. The second one that struck me was the appearance of agricultural support in the Scottish list, but the non-appearance of agricultural support in the Welsh list. Now that seems to me to be very striking, given that, and I looked the figures up, something like £275 million annually goes in direct subsidies to Welsh farmers under the cap. Now, so what does the non-appearance of agricultural support for Wales in that list, what does it portend? Does it portend anything, or is it a typo? If it's a typo, it's a remarkable typo, since it's £275 million a year.
Do either of the former Secretaries of State want to answer that question?
Well, I think it would be right up there in my list, but that's...
But I thought I should place that on the record, because I thought that the committee might like to inquire further into that in its
I love
its
challenging evidence. Thank you.
But can I just say the interesting thing about structural funds anyway is the whole debate around structural funds. You know, why are countries in the UK still in receipt of structural funds when structural funds are supposed to build up the economies in the area? You know, clearly they perhaps have not been the most successful of areas, but both of those should have been on the list in my view. Don't you agree?
Well, I think you should take it up with the current Secretary of State for Wales.
Kelvin Hopkins.
I've said many times publicly that the logical thing to do is simply replace, in the first instance, all EU spending with Treasury spending in all spheres automatically, and then after that to discuss how we go forward. But to have one country, devolved administration treated differently from another in these matters seems to me extraordinary. It strikes me as being a mistake.
Was that a question?
Going back,
you don't have to answer it. It wasn't a question.
No. Okay.
Marcus Fysh.
Just because I was going to ask about the intersections a bit later on, but I'll jump in with my question now. In terms of the proportion of the intersections which you think that there might need to be some further discussion, as you're saying, of a common framework. You've identified some of the areas, but could you give us a feel for sort of how much of the intersections that would cover? Because it actually sounds like, apart from the structural funds which you're talking about, most of those other things are in fact trade related. They're very much about the essential competence of the UK to be able to pursue a trade deal of one kind or another with different parts of the world. what percentage is that of the total number of intersections, do you think?
Well, one of the big differences between the Scottish and Welsh list, of course, is that the Scottish list includes a lot of justice and home affairs matters, reflecting the fact that Scotland has its own legal system, its own judicial system, whereas Wales, for the moment, at least doesn't. But whether realistically there is a need for common frameworks in justice and home affairs, I'm a little bit sceptical about that. It may be that there is, it makes sense, but I don't see it as a matter of absolute necessity in the same way perhaps as the sort of trade-related areas that you're drawing attention to, which again inclines me to the conclusion that we are talking about. So if we come down from 111 to 64, take out justice and home affairs, we are talking about a relatively small number of areas in which common frameworks would indeed be required.
Two points, if I may, Mr. Fysh. I mean, the first one that we would clearly have to sign up would be the environment, right? There's a lot on the list in terms of environment. We would all understand about externalities and the environmental protection shouldn't stop at borders inside the UK and so on and so forth. So there's that area I think we should think about. Second, I'm going to resist answering your question because it seems to me that some of these items are far more significant than others, and so that just doing a numerical count isn't actually very helpful, because we might, for example, have voting rights and candidacy rules for EU citizens in local government elections. I mean, that would be sort of item one, and then another item would be state aid. Well, just doing a numerical count on that doesn't seem to me to get us very far.
I suppose the only other point I would add is that we should resist the temptation, which is, I think, created by lists of this kind. Resist the temptation to treat this as an invitation to rewrite the devolution settlement, so that we end up just focusing down on these individual powers and saying, well, where does this belong, which I think would be to miss the bigger picture.
Can I ask one follow-up? You sort of mentioned that effectively it would be good to all get together and try to decide on some of these common frameworks, but in the time frame available for making those sorts of decisions, is it really realistic that we could get there, given that we are effectively in the middle of a major trade negotiation right now with our EU friends and allies, and that will impact what we're able to do in trade around the rest of the world? Is it practical for us to be effectively doing a constitutional convention as affects these trade areas?
Now that is the purpose of my proposed standstill agreement, that we do nothing until we actually work this out, which will involve no change for the time being, and not therefore to imperil existing arrangements.
I mean, we're talking here about internal developments. I mean, we can buy ourselves time in a way by having that kind of standstill agreement if that is seen to be a problem. And I think the answer to your question is that some will prove easier than others, right? And some of them we can replicate very quickly. Some of them, for example, there's one here about the ability to move to the European Union for health treatment if you can't get it suitably quickly on the NHS. Well, presumably that just goes. And so we don't have to deal with that. Or indeed, if we were going to have an analogy to that, we could probably agree that very quickly by concordat within the NHS, the different parts of the NHS around the United Kingdom. One wouldn't have to legislate on that.
Can I ask, looking at Clause 11 as it is, what would happen if there was, at the top of Clause 11, there was a positive duty to devolve where possible? An obligation on the government.
How would that be expressed?
I don't know.
How would it be enforced?
I don't know. What would happen also if there was a qualification attached to Clause 1 be in 4A of the Act of the Scottish Parliament, referring to the Act of the Scottish Parliament, if it was qualified in some way, such as at the end of that it said, for example, which would substantially affect trade or the conditions of competition, so that it was clear that it was only intended for a certain purpose, that restriction existed on the Scottish Parliament.
Yes, it's an interesting question. I think, we were talking about this before we came in, that the bill as drafted is a mechanical, if you like, application of EU law as it stands at the moment, or a replication of EU law as it stands at the moment, without consideration or little regard or understanding of the devolution settlements. And therefore I would be wary of simply tinkering with the wording of the clauses or possible amendments, as opposed to saying, well, do we really need this? I would flank my GMC common frameworks, for whatever format we choose, in order to work out these common frameworks, with a GMC on EU law revision. What changes do we actually need to make to the statute book to ensure that it functions properly? Who's going to make these changes? Are they going to be made by the UK government on a UK-wide or GB-wide basis, or are they going to be made by the devolved?
Well, that could happen anyway, and then Clause 11 just becomes a backstop.
Yeah, well,
yes. Well, my answer to that, Chair, is that Clause 11 is a poor choice of model, right? And that the way you deal with this is essentially by seeing parliamentary sovereignty as not a first-up exercise, but as a reserve power in the background to require common frameworks if at the end of the day, after a mature discussion between colleagues across the United Kingdom, you cannot create the relevant common frameworks that colleagues agree that you require. So from my perspective, it's not an answer to kind of create tinkering amendments to what I regard as a poor choice of model in the first place.
David Morris.
Sorry, just one very brief point, and you mentioned mature conversation, just to revert to Mr. Fysh's point. We haven't got a huge amount of time for mature conversation.
Oh yes, we have.
Well,
why don't we?
Several answers to that. I mean, clearly we're in a sea of uncertainty. We don't know quite what the times are. I would say, of course, I would remind colleagues that I said that we should have started this 6 months ago, right? And I would be very suspicious of UK ministers who came along and said, having done very little on this for 6 months, we've now not got enough time to do it. Yes, they've got enough time if they exercise, if Whitehall has the capacity, the devolved administrations are ready and they are willing to go. We already have an agreement between all the administrations that there will be another committee meeting of JMC European negotiations before Christmas. My sense is that the first Secretary of State, Damien Green, has now injected real urgency into this process. My sense from what Mr. Green is saying and from what Mr. Mandel is saying is that they think that this can be done, and let's crack on with it.
Ronnie Cowan.
Back an hour on Sunday morning. We'd have to put them back about 2 years to have enough time to actually to finish this debate. Yeah.
Okay, I'll take that as an intervention and not a question. Mr. Flynn.
Well, just to go back 2 years, nearly 2 years, the choice that the voters had on June the 23rd, 2016, was between Operation Fear and Operation Lies, in the belief that second, well-informed thoughts are always superior to first, ill-informed thoughts. Don't you think the confusion, panic that we have at the moment, where the Foreign Secretary has promised 150% of the money we'll have back to the health service, and Mr. Gove has promised 40% to the farming industry, that we're in a state of such confusion and chaos that it's duty of the House to turn down this settlement we have and offer the electorate second thoughts on what is a choice that's transformed to what they originally voted on.
No, you've no need to answer that question if you don't wish. It's outside the scope of this inquiry.
Mr. Flynn asked me the same question in the Welsh Affairs Committee a week ago, and I took the view, Chair, that you've just expressed.
Mr. Fysh.
It's really just to follow up on this idea of a standstill and the time that we have to make some of these decisions. To what degree should the UK government be worried about the policy divergences that can emerge, and to what extent do you see your idea of a standstill potentially going into the concept of a transition or an implementation period, which has been discussed in terms of our dealings with the EU?
Well, I think the standstill agreement covers both of these, because Clause 11 is drafted on the assumption, and I think we can accept it as correct for the moment, that EU law, as it applies presently, secures these common frameworks. Now, as I've indicated in my evidence, I think looking to the future, this is not the right way about establishing or working out the frameworks that we require in the future. But for the time being, at least, if we have a standstill agreement, then all of that stays. We won't change it. And so, which is why I look slightly askance at the suggestion, we got to get on with this and we don't really have the time. So long as we agree that we're not going to do anything that will threaten the integrity of the UK single market, then I don't see that pressure of time. We can get this right. And as Professor Rawlings has said.
Thank you, Chair. So believe in the EU. What challenges do you think that we're going to face in establishing a UK common framework from the existing European common frameworks? How are we going to transition the powers over? What would it look like? What would that framework be? How quick would that be in your considerations?
Well, the GMC European negotiations has gone some way towards answering these questions with the principles that were established a week past Monday. But the questions, as I see it, are: one, where do we actually need common frameworks? Two, what will they consist of? And the principles established at that GMCN meeting established a variety of mechanisms and modes which these frameworks might take. Do they need to be on a statutory basis? And if so, are we talking about a UK-wide statutory basis or a mixed basis involving UK legislation and legislation by the devolved legislatures or executives? And crucially, and this goes back to the point that where we began really, about the suspicion or fear on the part of the devolved administrations that this is about stripping them from powers, is how are these frameworks, how are they going to be managed, and crucially, how are they going to be changed in future? Because they're not going to be fixed for all time. So we're talking about frameworks that will need to be adapted, adjusted, and who is involved in those discussions. And this goes back to what was being said about it.
So do you actually think that what we're going to be seeing is much the same of what's already in existence, other than legislation changing some primary aspects of it, like the judiciary, for instance?
Well, if you take my earlier answer, where your starting point is, well, what is it already reserved, then I think, yes, we are looking at pretty much what we've got at the moment. I don't see substantial changes.
Well, my answer to that would be that I think one has to think in terms of not of a common framework, but common frameworks, right? And that the conclusions one reaches in different sectors may be different. right? And I think one point I would like to emphasise to the committee. I think we've got to be aware. We've got to beware the knee-jerk reaction that because there was a common framework at EU level, we necessarily need a common framework at UK level. Why there are common frameworks in the EU, of course, reflects a political, a particular set of dynamics in the EU, historical, political, ever greater union, and all of that. And that may or may not be appropriate when we come back to the UK. I mean, simply in terms of the closeness of the UK and shared administrative cultures. For example, one could think that, and I think this is particularly important when it comes to governance requirements. Governance requirements which one may have been imposing across 28 member states with very different administrative traditions and, shall we say, in some cases, very difficult challenges governmentally, we may take the view inside the United Kingdom that perhaps we don't need to go there. Right, that we have a more shared administrative culture. We have particular standards that colleagues across the UK will be expected to adhere to, and the very closeness of the United Kingdom. And it seems to me that, in a sense, part of the logic of Brexit would be that one would explore, right, over time, whether one could develop common standards which were more tailored to inside the UK than perhaps they are at the present time, given that they have to be tailored for 28 member states.
Do you see a situation occurring where, when we actually do come out in a few years' time, where we could possibly have a better working relationship with Europe based on the frameworks that we're putting or adapting in place from the existing European frameworks that we're adopting at this moment in time? In layman's terms, do you think we'll evolve it from where Europe are actually imposing their legislative measures on us, we can cherry pick what we want to do and therefore interface with Europe on our basis?
Well, what I heard of that question with the division bell going, I think I'm going to resist that question too. First, because I do think it's somewhat outside the terms of this inquiry. But secondly, because you are asking us there to project so far ahead, and of course so much will depend on the withdrawal agreement and what our future relationship is. So I think I'd pass on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Cheryl Gillan.
I want to take you both on to the inter-institutional relations, because this committee wrote a report back in 2016 about those institutional relationships, which in fact was quite critical because we felt that the JMC was really not fit for purpose. And I don't know whether I speak for my colleague, but having been a member of the JMC, I would agree that it needed, and indeed had done a lot of work about this before I came into government, because I felt that the levels of communications between devolved administrations in the UK government was very poor, and also between departments and officials, and this needed bolstering. So I have a series of questions here about it, but I notice in your report, Professor Rawlings, that you suggest a JMC DSM, domestic single market, and a JMC international trade, and you refer to the JMCEN, again, not having met, but also the JMC has been used for dispute resolution, thinking of the Olympic Games and the transport element, whether it was barnetised or not. Do you really think that it's fit for purpose, the JMC as a body? And have you got any suggestions as to how it might change or evolve? Because when I read, I've just been reading on here the response of the government to the report, I still don't think that it has gone far enough down the road to make sure that those communications are serious, in-depth, effective, and regular as well. So I would love to hear both your views on that.
Professor Rawlings.
Okay. Well, two points, if I may, Ms. Gillan. I wanted to put the idea of the domestic single market out there, because at the moment we're focused on JMC European negotiations, and clearly at some point those negotiations will stop, right? And so what I was trying to do was to project ahead as to the kind of machinery that we would want. And it does seem to me, and again, it seems to me to fit with the logic of Brexit here. We will have our own internal market, and it seems to me that we really need a forum for constant review and supervision of that single market, because in the nature of things, conditions change. New developments happen. So I think we need, I really wanted colleagues to begin to think about life beyond EU negotiations. So that was kind of point one. And then
can I just say, should it be a JMC or should that be a new department in each of the relevant departments? For example, in biz or in agriculture, etc. Should we have a completely new structure for talking from the departments themselves on the domestic single market with the devolved institutions?
Okay, so Alan wants to...
Sorry.
Yes, if I understand the basic thrust of your question, I think one of the critical weaknesses of the existing machinery of intergovernmental relations, if you like, is that too much is left to the uncoordinated activities of individual departments. There is an absence of central coordination and control. And when we start to talk about Brexit and the implementation of Brexit and getting the statute book into shape, the post-Brexit statute book into shape, then we are looking at that in spades, because all these powers 7, 8, 9, it is where the minister considers that retained EU law is whatever. So we're facing a very decentralised lawmaking process with different departments taking different views. So there is a genuine need, I think, to actually get a grip of all of this, to have effective central coordination and control, which, going back to your original question, which was about the effectiveness of the machinery of intergovernmental relations, I think has to involve some sort of department or intergovernmental relations department of the regions and nations, however you want to put it, of the United Kingdom, rather than relying on the combination of, I don't want to emphasise their ineffectiveness, but weak territorial departments, 3 territorial departments, and departments doing their own thing with or without regard to the devolves.
I put some thought into this when I was in opposition, and when we came into government, when we were in a coalition government, I persuaded my colleagues to start a cabinet subcommittee, which had a minister from each department that was responsible for the devolves and the policy, and to try and drag it together, because there seems to me there needs to be a complementary structure in the UK government that actually can talk and draw that together rather than leaving the departments out there in isolation. Sadly, our coalition partners disagreed, and the Deputy Prime Minister decided to dispense with that. But it was a forerunner before this of trying to get that together. Do you think that that we actually need a completely new structure to give us a working tool for the future? Because at the moment, I personally don't see the JMC as being the best vehicle.
I don't know about an entirely new structure, but we do need a fresh start. I mean, if anything comes out of this, it is the recognition that intergovernmental relations is every bit as important a part of the devolution settlements as the powers possessed by the individual devolved administrations. And that can't simply be left to happenstance, chance, the inclination, instinct of individual administrations. And therefore, and I did argue this with the House of Lords Constitution Committee at the previous inquiry, I think the basic machinery has to be put on a statutory footing so that the parliaments are making it clear this is our expectations as to the way these relations will be conducted, rather than leaving it to the discretion of individual administrations.
In my report, Mr. Gillan, I pushed down 2 lines institutionally. First, in terms of the my idea of a domestic single market, committee. I suggested that should be, we should be thinking about a statutory base for it, and that I don't want to be too prescriptive, but it seems to me that it should be on a statutory base. There should be an independent secretariat, and if there is one thing that we have learned in the last year, there really should be entitlements for all the administrations of the UK to say we want a meeting, right? And it just cannot be in the gift of one government to say, well, all right, when we feel like it. And we should put this on record. I mean, the UK government is in breach, right, of its of the Memorandum of Understanding. The Memorandum of Understanding says that if a JMC meeting is requested by one of the administrations, it should happen within a month, and this did not happen. So we've got to do something there. And then secondly, I did address the central coordinating point. I thought about doing it, through the UK Cabinet Office, right? That to me would be the way through. But I absolutely agree with you, right, that we have got to have, so we have to have that with the devolves. Inside Whitehall, we need much firmer central coordination. I couldn't agree with you.
I'm just going to jump over a question from the Chairman just to finish off my section here, because do you think putting it on a statutory basis would improve the trust and the understanding between the legislatures? You clearly, I think that's the message I'm getting from you. But what else destroys the trust between the legislatures? Because there seems to be still a lot of positioning.
Oh, yeah,
I don't want to put it more strongly than that.
We have a lot of ingredients or factors that might contribute to mistrust or distrust. 4 parts of the United Kingdom did not vote in the same way. The Scottish government its policy is one of independence, seeking an independence referendum, which is on hold for the moment. The UK government does not speak with one voice in relation to BrExit. But I think the singular item that is missing, or how do you overcome this, is dialogue, communication. Drafting a bill in secret and then only showing it to the devolved administration 2 weeks before it's made public is guaranteed to create suspicion as to what are they up to here, what are they going to do, and so communication, dialogue, and communication, I think, is the first principle in the Memorandum of Understanding. Has to be the beginning of an answer. It's not a complete answer, but a way forward.
Do you think there's a JMC called JMC Sherpas, which is officials? Do you think that meets frequently enough? Do you think that's effective enough?
I would assume not, but I don't know.
I think that UK ministers were not particularly interested in having multilateral meetings of the JMC over a number of months. And I should say, and I said this in my report, I have a particular concern about this because if we're talking about common frameworks, it seems to me that the logic of common frameworks is multilateralism, because everybody's got to be in the room and everybody's got to be talking about common frameworks and what can work for them or what may be their sticking points and so on and so forth. And of course there will be bumps. Of course there will be bumps in the road. Colleagues will have different interests and they have different constituencies to represent. But if we don't get in the same room, if we don't go through that, then it seems to me all to be very difficult.
The future architecture of government is something that concerns this committee. I mean, where is the department for BrExit going to end up? What is going to be the shape of government? Can I just take you possibly a tiny bit further, but related to this? Do you think that the architecture of government should be looking at having one cabinet minister responsible for the devolved relationships, or do you still think that territorial secretaries of state are a key part of the equation?
I think the conclusion I came to 2 years ago, whenever the House of Lords Constitution Committee conducted its inquiry, was that the case for a single department, a single minister responsible for these relations, was unarguable. I would favour that.
Could you? It's in your evidence to the House of Lords, is it? Forgive me, it's in your evidence.
Yes.
Do you agree with that, Professor?
I generally do. I do note, for understandable reasons, that we haven't, I think, mentioned Northern Ireland today, and I'm always a little hesitant on this one because, I certainly wouldn't claim to be an expert on Northern Ireland, but I'm sure colleagues would want to look very carefully at that question through a Northern Ireland lens, because I'm sure we all agreed that we would not wish to do anything to make the situation in Northern Ireland more difficult than it is. And I can see that certainly at the present time, there is a particular issue there. And we must bear that in mind.
Yeah, notwithstanding that. So actually one territorial department, perhaps with a Secretary of State, but then with Ministers of State for each of the three devolved administrations, would be something which would probably improve and focus that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry.
Just to challenge my colleague, how would it be perceived in, say, Scotland, if the minister in the government, and the UK government, was downgraded from Secretary of State to, say, Minister of State and no longer sat at the cabinet table?
I suppose the question is, who is the interlocutor? Is it the Secretary of State, Scotland's voice in the Cabinet's voice in Scotland, or is it the Scottish Government? We're 20 years into devolution. I think we have to move on, and I don't think...
Well, it's what this committee recommended in the 2010 Parliament, when we were wondering how to reduce the number of ministers.
If I may, Cheryl, on that last point, surely the Scottish Government is only the interlocutor for Scotland in the devolved areas. Whereas, of course, the Secretary of State for Scotland has a far wider role, and similarly, of course, for Wales.
That then takes us on to a big issue which we haven't really touched on in this session, but that is what in federalism terms would be described as shared rule. We've spoken a lot about self-rule, the powers of the devolved nations, the devolved administrations. We can only go so far with that. I think sooner or later we have to face up to the question of the voice of the devolved administrations in relation to decisions taken in the reserved areas.
Okay.
And I wouldn't pretend that was an easy question, but I think it's a question that has to be faced.
Just again, following on, I mean, just give us a description of what you feel a really successful dialogue between the UK government and the devolved governments would actually feel like and look like, and how would it happen from now?
Well, it would be a really successful one would be one which all the participants came out feeling that their views had been expressed.
Yes, but how would the actual process look and feel at the moment that it doesn't look and feel? What should happen? What should be happening that would make you feel comfortable there was going to be a good outcome?
Right. Actually, this is where I think we get close back to your report, Chair, on intergovernmental relations. I mean, what I would like to see is a very active JMC European negotiations, meeting regularly now, as I think the First Secretary has indicated will happen. And then under the umbrella of the JMC, individual work streams targeted on agriculture, targeted on environment, bringing the officials and the relevant ministers together. And of course that's very much, Chair, what this committee suggested in its report on interinstitutional relations. I mean, I think, I was actually reading it again last night in preparation for today, and you actually, it's interesting, you actually picked up, right, things like agriculture, things like the environment that we've been discussing today as very much designated policy work streams that colleagues should be pursuing. So that I can't help feeling that quite a bit of the answer to the question you just raised is actually in the report from this committee.
I'm very encouraged by that. But Professor Page?
Yes, I would agree with what Professor Rawlings has said, and I confess not having read your previous report in quite the same degree of detail. I did indeed look at it. But yes, it can't simply be a series of ad hoc occasional meetings between ministers. It has to be underpinned by joint working between the administrations on a very different basis from that which takes place at present.
And if there were structural reforms or new institutional arrangements created, how much confidence would you have that would fix the problem?
That's why I think both of us would like to see a statutory underpinning.
Right.
Right. We think that would be helpful in generating trust, and I think from what I don't wish to put words in the committee's mouth, but what I've heard this morning, I get the sense that the colleagues see the importance of a fresh start, and that what has happened over the last few months, we've really got to do better than that. And then just to pick up on Mr. Fysh's point, I think goes on from the question that was asked. I mean, I'd want to see some draft common frameworks out there, right? Let's get on with it, right? We don't have to kind of create common frameworks that are completely signed off. Let's have some common frameworks put out to stakeholders. And then, as Mr. Jones was commenting, then we can have engagement with the key stakeholders as to whether a common framework works for them, right? So that's the process that I would very much like to see. Intense work now between ministers and officials in the particular areas, and then getting the documents out into the public domain so that we can have an open, engagement with key stakeholders.
You mentioned creating some statutory underpinning to these institutional arrangements. Is that something that would fit comfortably into the EU withdrawal bill?
I suspect not. It would be taking it off in a slightly different direction. That's not what the EU withdrawal bill is about. It's about the legal consequences of BrExit. But I think it has to be firmly on the agenda as part of a reconstituted United Kingdom, which has the machinery in place, the arrangements in place to address the wider consequences. These are the immediate consequences, but I think the burden of the session that we've had is that the questions go much broader than simply getting the statute book into shape or working out common frameworks.
Well, I think you've been an absolutely wonderful pair of witnesses. You've challenged our thinking and expanded our imagination, and you've been a really great help to this inquiry. Are there any other questions? Thank you very much indeed for being with us today.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Order.
Thank you.